This video is brought to you by Blinkist. The first 100 people to go to blinkist.com/biographics will get 1 week to try it out for free. You'll also get 25% off the cost of full membership if you want it. More on them in a bit. In the spring of 985 AD, a small fleet set sail on a history-making mission. Among the crew were hundreds of men and women looking to start afresh, to begin new lives far from home. They took with them livestock, timber, all of the things they'd need to establish themselves at the edge of the world. It was a leap of faith, not just because of the treacherous voyage, not just because they were attempting to found a colony where no one had ever lived before. No, it was because these people were placing not just their futures, but their lives in the hands of a single man. His name was Erik the Red, and he was destined to found Greenland's first Norse settlement. Born to a criminal father in Norway, Erik had spent most of his life as a minor nobody eking out an existence on the edges of Iceland. But then he got involved in a dispute, and everything had changed. Banished from his home, Erik was forced to sail west in search of new lands, only to wind up settling the largest island of them all. It was 950 AD when Erik Thorvaldsson was born in a place called Rogaland in the southwest of Norway. At least, we assume it was. As you're about to see, pretty much everything to do with Erik the Red's life involves a bunch of guesswork, a whole lot of caveats, and the understanding that anywhere up to 90% might just be, well, horse manure. That's because our hero today was born in a time and place in which complex written records weren't yet widely used. Instead, people relied on oral traditions, telling each other stories, passing them down, maybe subtly altering them with each telling. Famously, this includes the sagas, from where we get everything that we know about Erik the Red. The problem? The saga of Erik the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders wasn't written down until something like over 200 years since it died. So rather than me going, historians assume that, or it's suspected that, every time I mention a fact, let's just agree now that this entire episode comes with a massive caveat titled, "Warning, all of this could be absolute bullshit." Now, with that being said, we do have enough archaeological evidence to say that Erik was a real person and that his most famous deeds did really happen. It's just where his personal life is concerned that things get frustratingly vague. To return to our opening, we commonly assume Erik was born in 950 because it matches up with the other dates given in the sagas. But we don't actually know this any more than we know that he had the nickname Erik the Red, which could be to do with the color of his hair or his legendary temper. All we know for sure is what the sagas tell us, that sometime around the 960s, Erik and his father Thorvald arrived in Iceland after Thorvald managed to get his ass banned from Norway, likely for killing someone. If that's the case, then exile in Iceland was certainly a fitting punishment. First settled roughly a century earlier, Iceland had been one of the focal points of a great wave of Norse migration. Brought on by political changes at home, the migration had seen the Norse settle all over northwest Europe, from England to Ireland to the Shetland Islands and Faroes. Iceland was simply the most distant land that they colonized. In this, the Norse were helped by something known as the medieval warm period, a 4th century summer holiday in which temperatures spiked around Europe, making even an island on the edge of the Arctic Circle easily habitable. All told, about 20,000 people would settle Iceland, and that was a major problem for Erik and his pa. By the time they showed up in the 960s, all the good land was already gone. Even the not-so-good lands, the mediocre lands, and the actually kinda sucky land had all been snapped up. The best Erik and Thorvald could manage was the super crappy land at Hornstrandir, a place of poor soil quality and a short growing season. Clearly, father and son were in trouble, but they weren't the only ones who were going to have difficulties farming in Iceland. All across the island, overgrazing was driving down soil quality, making life harder. So when Erik eventually comes to pitch his Greenland colony to the locals, there's going to be a surprising number of people thinking, well, it's gotta be a lot better than here. But look, all of that is in the future. For now, Erik and Thorvald could do nothing but try to tend the unforgiving land and hope that their lives would soon be changed for the better. Luckily, Erik wouldn't have to wait very long at all. In a few short years, he was going to catch his first break, the break that would set him on the path towards becoming one of the greatest Norse explorers of all time. In the end, Erik the Red would escape his miserable corner of Hornstrandir, not through hard work, grit, or sheer determination, but by marrying upwards. Thorhild was the daughter of a wealthy man who owned a swath of Haukadalur, a long valley, the name of which can roughly be translated as Valley of the Hawks. After she married Erik, her good old dad opened a corner of his estate for the couple to build their home on. Erik abandoned the islands north, moved south, and founded a small farm that he called Eiríksstaðir. It was nothing fancy. Archaeologists uncovered the footprints and found it to be on the small side, but at least it was an area that was better suited to farming. Unfortunately, this lucky break was also accompanied by tragedy. Sometime around Erik's marriage, his dad Thorvald kicked the bucket. The exact date and cause of death are unknown. All we know is that he exited the narrative before his son ever had a chance to do anything of note. If he did leave a legacy, it seems to have been passing on to Erik a knack for getting banished from various places, as we are about to see. Erik and Thorhild created quite the little brood. They had 3 sons and 1 daughter, the latter of whom some sources say was born to another woman that Erik was seeing. There's not much point in us going into any detail on these kids, with one exception. Around 970, Thorhild gave birth to a son that they called Leif. Since Norse names were patronymic, meaning they included the father's given name, the boy's full name was Leif Erikson, and Leif would soon grow up to rival his father as an explorer. Not that Erik had actually really done any exploring yet. He was too busy being a standard-issue Icelandic farmer, raising his children, quarreling with his neighbors, and trying to keep his servants in line. It was these 2 last points that were about to turn everything upside down. Around 980, some of Erik's thralls accidentally caused a landslide. Captured slaves or serfs, thralls were basically people's property. So when their landslide damaged the farm of Erik's neighbor, Eyjolf dealt with them not as people, but as things. He dispatched his kinsman, the delightfully named Eyjolf the Foul, who slaughtered the thralls. And just like that, Eyjolf signed his own death warrant. Remember earlier when we said that Erik the Red's nickname may have been due to his foul temper? Well, this is the moment when we show you exactly why that might have been. Rather than just go to the law, Erik grabbed his own weapons, marched right over to Eyjolf's farm, and slaughtered Eyjolf the Foul. While this might sound like a tit-for-tat killing today, in Erik's time it was like going ballistic and shooting your neighbor because he scratched your car. Thralls were property. Dudes like Eyjolf, the now pretty dead, were people. That meant legal proceedings being launched against Erik. It meant being banished from the Valley of Hawks as punishment and starting a new life on the island of Oxney. Sadly for his family, this was just the start of Erik's neighbor-killing spree. While building his new homestead, Erik lent some seat posts to a local. Carved with Viking symbols and considered to have mystic powers, these posts were hugely valuable. Erik's dad had brought them all the way from Norway. So when Erik asked for the seat posts back in 982, the neighbor was all like, actually, they're kind of mine now. And, well, the outcome was inevitable. Blinded with bright red rage, Erik stormed his neighbor's farm and took the seat posts by force. Then he organized an ambush to attack the rival clan, killing the neighbor's 2 sons. For the Icelanders, this was the last straw. Erik was tried again, found guilty again, and banished again. Only this time he wasn't just chucked out of his local area. This time Erik would be exiled from the whole of Iceland. Now we'll get back to our video in just a minute, but first here's a quick word from today's fantastic sponsor, Blinkist. It's the heart of July, which means that you're probably looking to check some books off your summer reading list. Few things are better than sitting in the park or maybe just lying on the beach, cracking a good book that you've been looking forward to. Now, if you want that same dopamine hit of new information, but without the hours of personal investment it takes to read something from cover to cover, well, that's where Blinkist comes in. It's a great app that offers easily digestible 15-minute summaries of all of the best non-fiction books. There's more than 3,000 of them. You can either read them or listen to the audio version. Personally, I listen about 90% of the time, just like a short, little, value-packed podcast episode. It's easier to fit into my day that way while doing mindless things or walking to work, the kind of everyday activities that you can listen to stuff during. 14 million active users are currently using Blinkist to get the best insights and need-to-know information from thousands of books, from self-help to business to health. Whatever you're into, it's going to be on there. For example, if you're enjoying this video on Erik the Red, perhaps you'd enjoy Sea Power, the history and geopolitics of the world's oceans, by retired US Navy Admiral James Stavridis. It's a 21-minute read. Then you can move on to your next book just like that. So if you're interested in learning big ideas in small packages, head to Blinkist.com/Biographics, and the first 100 of you will get 1 week to try out Blinkist free. You'll also get 25% off if you want the full membership. Again, 7-day trial, cancel at any time at Blinkist.com/Biographics. Decades before Erik did for Iceland what Michael Douglas did for LA in Falling Down, a guy called Gunnbjorn Ulf Krakason found himself having a minor problem. At some point in the late 9th or early 10th century, Gunnbjorn had been on his way to Iceland when a giant storm blew up and sent him wildly off course. And fair warning, giant storms blowing random dudes off course is going to be something of a recurring theme in today's video. Anyway, when Gunnbjorn's storm at last died down, he spied a distant, forbidding coast. It was the first sighting of Greenland in European history. Over the following decades, news of Gunnbjorn's bizarre adventure spread across Iceland. By the time Erik was sentenced to 3 years exile, the sighting of this distant land was widely known, so Erik decided to go and explore it. And to be clear, this was absolutely nuts. The Denmark Strait separating Iceland and Greenland is a 700-mile death trap, frequently clogged with ice and plagued with thick fogs and dreadful storms. And it's not like Erik had nowhere else to go. The Faroes, the Shetlands, Ireland, England, none of these places to the east and south had yet banned him. But for whatever reason, Erik had his heart set on this mysterious western land. In the spring of 982, Erik, his family, thralls, and a small group of friends departed Iceland on a 3-year voyage. They travelled in a ship called a Nar, a sail-powered alternative to the classic Norse longship. Their livestock travelled with them. It could have been the end of Erik, the last that anyone saw of him. Instead, it wound up being his making. The Nar survived the journey to Greenland, finally sighting land near what we today call the Ammassalik Fjord. But because the approach was so blocked with ice, Erik was forced to follow the coastline all the way around the island's southern tip. What he saw on the western coast was the best kind of shock. Unlike the east, Greenland's western coast is comparatively hospitable. There's more habitable land, easier approaches, less of a sense that the ocean actively wants to kill you. It's been said that for centuries, Erik gave Greenland its name as a piece of propaganda, a way of enticing settlers to this cold and remote place. But green is also a pretty fair description of that western coast. For someone who'd just traversed 700 miles of frozen ocean, it looked like a verdant paradise. The majority of Erik's first year was spent establishing a base at modern-day Kassiarsøk, temperate islands that would soon become the focal point of Greenland's eastern settlement. As spring returned, his team began seriously exploring the unknown lands, taking ships further up the coast, driving deeper into the interior. What they found was a surprisingly inviting world. While inland was frozen tundra, there was a good 20 to 30 miles of arable land clutching the western coast. The climate in these fjords was similar to Iceland. The soil was good too, or at least as good as could be expected. But while Erik had found a place capable of supporting life, he never found any other humans. Although indigenous peoples had previously settled this part of Greenland, by Erik's time all their colonies had been long abandoned. This wasn't an occupied place that colonists would have had to fight for. It was truly virgin land, ripe for the taking. In 985, Erik decided to do just that. That summer, he took his boat and turned to Iceland. But it wasn't settling back into his old life that was on Erik's mind. Oh no. He'd liked what he'd seen of Greenland, liked the climate, the vegetation, the open space. Most of all, he'd liked the freedom to be someone important, away from all these annoying laws about not killing your neighbors. As he sailed away, Erik swore that he'd return to Greenland. And this time, he'd bring enough people with him to make it permanent. While the name Greenland might not have been pure marketing, there's no doubt Erik sold his new colony like a PR master. Back in Iceland, he told everyone who'd listen, "Guys, have I ever got a great investment idea for you?" before extolling the island's ease of living. It was a long shot pitch, up sticks with me and move 700 miles across dangerous ocean. But for many, it was also supremely tempting. Remember, Iceland's soil is in decline at this stage. Life is getting harder, hard enough to convince hundreds of people to roll everything on one flame-haired explorer's mad gamble. Finally, some 14 to 15 winters before Christianity came to Iceland, the sagas say that Erik was ready. That year, anywhere between 25 and 35 ships, the number varies depending on the source, cast off into the frozen seas. For those of us used to hearing about the colonization of the Americas, the word can denote an ever-increasing mass of people that eventually just dominates everything. But the Norse experience in Greenland was totally different. At its absolute height, long after Erik's death, it's estimated that the island was home to slightly over 2,500 people, a tiny fraction of the number living on Iceland. In Erik's time, the number was even smaller. His Greenland consisted of maybe 350 people plus a whole bunch of livestock clinging to a tiny temperate zone on the edge of a frozen wasteland. Colonists soon divided into two settlements. The eastern settlement centered around the ford Erik had first occupied during his exile, and the smaller western settlement 240 miles north. Between the two, tiny hamlets sprang up, little more than lone farmsteads dotted along the coast. Yet it would be a mistake to think farming was all the Greenland colonists did. While agriculture was an important part of their lives, one which saw them push medieval farming to its limits in such high latitudes, it certainly couldn't sustain them. For one thing, the growing season was brutally short. For another, samples show it probably took colonists a whole generation to adapt to the soil conditions. So, how did they survive in this inhospitable world? For that, we need to look away from the land and to the water. While it might not have trees, one thing Greenland does have in abundance is seals. Pretty much all excavations of old Greenland and middens or trash heaps have turned up seal bones, suggesting the colonists turned to hunting to supplement their diet from day one. But rather than just grabbing any passing seal, bashing its brains out and feasting on the blubber, the Greenlanders did their hunting in a surprisingly sustainable way. Although harbor seals dotted the shores near their settlements, the colonists seemed to have realized they could easily hunt these creatures to extinction. So instead, they targeted harp seals, which were harder to catch, but existed in far greater numbers, meaning their stock could be easily replenished. It was some savvy forward thinking, one that runs counter to the popular image of Vikings as a bunch of drunk, bearded slaughter machines. It also helped Erik's new colony survive long term. From the 350-odd first settlers, the Greenlanders would quickly grow to number 1,000. But just establishing one major colony apparently wasn't enough for Erik. Within 15 years, he'd soon have his sights set even further west, on a place that you and I know not as Greenland, but rather Canada. Remember back when that random dude got blown off course and we said it would become a theme in this video? Well, time to make good on that promise. In the early years of Erik's colony, a guy called Bjarni Herjólfsson set sail for Greenland, only for, surprise, surprise, a massive storm to blow him off course. When the winds died down, he and his crew finally spotted land, but not land any Europeans had ever seen before. The coast before them was heavily forested, unlike Greenland's treeless fords. It was such an unexpected sight that Bjarni refused to allow his men to land, instead sailing up the coast past another landmass covered in ice before bearing east and returning to Greenland. In doing so, he missed out on his chance to become the first European to set foot in North America. Today it's thought the icy hellscape Bjarni saw was Baffin Island, while the forested coasts were Newfoundland and Labrador. Had he agreed to let his men go ashore, Bjarni would probably now be starring in his own Biographics instead of just sulking in the corner of someone else's video. Still, his tale of yet another undiscovered world to the west sent shockwaves through Erik's colony and planted a seed in its ruler's mind. But before he could act on Bjarni's tip, Erik needed to get Greenland up and running. By now, he was head of the eastern settlement and living the life that he'd always dreamed of. He had a large home, authority, and acted like he was lord of all that he surveyed, which we guess he technically was. However, that didn't mean that Erik was free to do whatever he pleased. While he might have been chief of Greenland, there was still someone Erik needed to stay on the good side of, and that was the King of Norway. While it was remote, Greenland relied on trade with other Norse territories in order to survive. The colonists had stuff like timber they desperately needed to import, while they also boasted one important export: ivory. At the time, ivory artifacts were big business, and with large herds of walruses sheltering in a bay 300 miles north of the western settlement, the Greenlanders could easily corner the market. But opening a new trade route meant keeping in the good graces of those back home. Around 994, Erik dispatched his son Leif to Norway under instructions to basically tell the king, hey, the colony's doing great, here's some cool shit, please do not invade us. King Olaf evidently liked what he heard because he agreed on one condition, that Leif take Christianity back to Greenland with him. As a new convert, Olaf was determined to foist his religion on all Norsemen everywhere. Iceland would be converted around 999. Olaf wanted to ensure Greenland followed suit. So, when Leif finally returned home around 1000 AD, it was supposedly with a priest at his side. We say supposedly because there are some serious doubts that the Greenlanders converted so early. One commonly cited date is 1015, long after Leif's journey to Norway. But that's not the story the sagas tell. In their telling, Leif first convinced his mother, Thjodhild, to accept Christ before embarking on a journey all up and down the western coast converting the colonists, with maybe one exception. Unlike Thjodhild, Erik found Christianity about as appetizing as watching someone blow their nose in public and then open the tissue to examine its contents. In one version told in the Saga of Erik the Red, he held out for as long as possible, only being baptized long after everyone else. In another, the version in the Saga of the Greenlanders, he went to his grave a stubborn pagan, having never accepted Christ. If the latter is true, it may well be because Erik had something else on his mind in 1000 AD. Around the same time Leif returned, he announced to his father that he'd had a grand new idea. The two of them would sail west and settle that new landmass that Bjarni Herjólfsson had discovered. Together, they'd be the first Europeans in history to set foot in North America. In the end, Erik the Red just missed out on his chance to make history for the second time, refusing to accompany his son on the voyage west. As with so much in today's tale, the reasons are frustratingly vague. One reason has it that Erik decided he was just too old, another that he decided to go only to change his mind when he spotted bad omens. In another, he fell from a horse and injured himself on the day of departure, forcing him to abandon the voyage. Whatever the reason, when Leif set sail at the head of 35 men, Erik wasn't by his side. For such a famous explorer, this must have seemed like a tragedy. On his own history-changing voyage, Leif would first land on Baffin Island, followed by heading south to overwinter in Newfoundland. The settlement he established there is known today as L'Anse ou Meadows, and it signifies the beginning of a great chapter in Norse history, one which saw them set up the first European colonies in America. But that's a tale for another time. Back in Greenland, an epidemic had broken out among the colonists, killing hundreds. Although at least one saga says he survived longer, Erik the Red is traditionally thought to have died in the outbreak around the year 1001. Whether he lived long enough to see his son again and to hear tales of this strange new land depends on which saga you read. Whatever the truth of his death, there's no doubting what Erik left behind. Despite the epidemic, the Greenland colony was thriving. Far from being a frozen failure, it was attracting scores of new settlers every year, drawn by the promise of land, freedom, and riches. In fact, the Greenland colony would become so rich that, according to a surviving document from 1327, it was soon producing more profit from ivory than all 4,000 Icelandic farms could produce together. The date of that document, too, should tell you something of Greenland's fate. While Leif's American colony would last only a few winters, Norse Greenland soon became a simple fact of geography. The last known communication from the colony arrived in Iceland in 1424, over 4 centuries after Erik's death. In case you needed a reminding, the United States has so far survived for a little over half that time. Say what you like about Erik the Red, but he knew how to build a colony that would last. Of course, the Greenland settlements eventually died out or were abandoned for reasons we're still not totally sure of. The last evidence of any activity dates to around 1450. After that, it would be another 300 years before Scandinavians again returned to the frozen land. Today, Erik the Red has lost his mantle as the founder of Greenland. While the name he bestowed upon the island survives, modern inhabitants are almost uniformly of Inuit descent rather than Norse. Yet none of this detracts from his greatest achievement. At a time when the universe seemed to firmly stop at Iceland's western edge, Erik rolled everything on a perilous voyage to an unknown land. That he didn't just survive, but managed to establish a long-lived colony is all sorts of admirable. We may know little about his inner life today, or even what drove him, but we do know that Erik the Red was one of the era's most accomplished and most fascinating explorers. For that reason, if no other, he's worthy of being remembered. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, please do check out our fantastic sponsor, Blinkist. Link below. And thank you for watching.